Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com. Follow us on Instagram at snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the Apple Podcasts app. Also, share us with a friend. If you'd like to get an email once a week with upcoming sleep stories and other news, subscribe to the Snoozeletter at snoozecast.com. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by A Mother's Love. Tonight, we shall read the next chapter to Peter Pan, the 1911 novel by J.M. Barrie. If you'd like to start this story from the beginning, you can find the first episode aired on March 20th, 2019. An easy way to listen to this continuing story in order is at snoozecast.com/series. When we left off, Wendy and Peter end up on Marooner's rock with the tide coming in after a fight with the pirates. They are both too weak to swim to shore or fly home. The tide is getting higher and higher on the rock. Suddenly, Michael and John's kite drifts across the rock. The kite is too small to lift them both, so Peter tells Wendy to grab on and let it carry her home, sacrificing himself. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Chapter 9. The Neverbird. The last sound Peter heard before he was quite alone were the mermaids retiring one by one to their bedchambers under the sea. He was too far away to hear their doors shut, but every door in the coral caves where they live rings a tiny bell when it opens or closes, as in all the nicest houses on the mainland, and he heard the bells. Steadily, the waters rose till they were nibbling at his feet, and to pass the time until they made their final gulp, he watched the only thing on the lagoon. He thought it was a piece of floating paper, perhaps part of the kite, and wondered idly how long it would take to drift ashore. Presently, he noticed as an odd thing that it was undoubtedly out upon the lagoon with some definite purpose, for it was fighting the tide and sometimes winning. And when it won, Peter, always sympathetic to the weaker side, could not help clapping. It was such a gallant piece of paper. It was not really a piece of paper. It was the Neverbird, making desperate efforts to reach Peter on the nest. By working her wings in a way she had learned since the nest fell into the water, she was able to some extent to guide her strange craft. But by the time Peter recognized her, she was very exhausted. She had come to save him, to give him her nest, though there were eggs in it. I rather wonder at the bird, for though he had been nice to her, he had also sometimes tormented her. I can suppose only that, like Mrs. Darling and the rest of them, she was melted because he had all his first teeth. She called out to him what she had come for, and he called out to her what she was doing there. But of course, neither of them understood the other's language. In fanciful stories, people can talk to the birds freely, and I wish for the moment I could pretend that this were such a story, and say that Peter replied intelligently to the Neverbird. But truth is best, and I want to tell you only what really happened. Well, not only could they not understand each other, but they forgot their manners. I want you to get into the nest, the bird called, speaking as slowly and distinctly as possible. And then you can drift ashore, but I am too tired to bring it any nearer, so you must try to swim to it. What are you quacking about? Peter answered. Why don't you let the nest drift as usual? I want you, the bird said, and repeated it all over. Then Peter tried slow and distinct. What are you quacking about? And so on. The Neverbird became irritated. They have very short tempers. You dunder-headed little jay, she screamed. Why don't you do as I tell you? Peter felt that she was calling him names, and at a venture he retorted hotly, So are you. Then, rather curiously, they both snapped out the same remark. Shut up! Shut up! Nevertheless, the bird was determined to save him if she could, and by one last mighty effort, she propelled the nest against the rock. Then up she flew, deserting her eggs so as to make her meaning clear. Then, at last, he understood and clutched the nest and waved his thanks to the bird as she fluttered overhead. It was not to receive his thanks, however, that she hung there in the sky. It was not even to watch him get into the nest. It was to see what he did with her eggs. There were 2 large white eggs, and Peter lifted them up and reflected. The bird covered her face with her wings so as not to see the last of them, but she could not help peeping between the feathers. I forget whether I have told you that there was a stave on the rock, driven into it by some buccaneers of long ago to mark the site of buried treasure. The children had discovered the glittering hoard, and, when in a mischievous mood, used to fling showers of diamonds, pearls, and pieces of 8 to the gulls, who pounced upon them for food, and then flew away, raging at the scurvy trick that had been played upon them. The stave was still there, and on it Starkey had hung his hat, a deep tarpaulin, watertight with a broad brim. Peter put the eggs into this hat and set it on the lagoon. It floated beautifully. The Never Bird saw at once what he was up to and screamed her admiration of him. And, alas, Peter crowed his agreement with her. Then he got into the nest, reared the stave in it as a mast, and hung up his shirt for a sail. At the same moment, the bird fluttered down upon the hat and once more sat snugly on her eggs. She drifted in one direction, and he was borne off in another, both cheering. Of course, when Peter landed, he beached his little ship in a place where the bird would easily find it. But the hat was such a great success that she abandoned the nest. It drifted about till it went to pieces, and often Starkey came to the shore of the lagoon, and with many bitter feelings watched the bird sitting on his hat. As we shall not see her again, it may be worth mentioning here that all Never Birds now build in their shape of nest, with a broad brim on which the youngsters take an airing. Great were the rejoicings when Peter reached the home under the ground almost as soon as Wendy, who had been carried hither and thither by the kite. Every boy had adventures to tell, but perhaps the biggest adventure of all was that they were several hours late for bed. This so inflated them that they did various dodgy things to get staying up still longer, such as demanding bandages. But Wendy, though glorying in having them all home again safe and sound, was scandalized by the lateness of the hour and cried, "To bed, to bed," in a voice that had to be obeyed. Next day, however, she was awfully tender and gave out bandages to every one, and they played till bedtime at limping about and carrying their arms in slings. Chapter 10. The Happy Home. One important result of the brush with the pirates on the lagoon was that it made the tribal people their friends. Peter had saved Tiger Lily from a dreadful fate, and now there was nothing she and her braves would not do for him. All night they sat above, keeping watch over the home under the ground and awaiting the big attack by the pirates, which obviously could not be much delayed longer. Even by day they hung about, smoking the pipe of peace. They showed so much appreciation that eventually Peter would end it by commanding that Peter Pan has spoken. It meant that they must now shut up, and they accepted it humbly in that spirit. But they were by no means so respectful to the other boys, whom they looked upon as just ordinary braves. They said, "How do?" to them, things like that. And what annoyed the boys was that Peter seemed to think this all right. Secretly, Wendy sympathized with them a little, but she was far too loyal a housewife to listen to any complaints against Father. Father knows best, she always said, whatever her private opinion must be. Her private opinion was that these nativers should not call her a squaw. We have now reached the evening that was to be known among them as the Night of Nights, because of its adventures and their upshot. The day, as if quietly gathering its forces, had been almost uneventful, and now the tribe, in their blankets, were at their posts above, while, below, the children were having their evening meal, all except Peter, who had gone out to get the time. The way you got the time on the island was to find the crocodile and then stay near him till the clock struck. The meal happened to be a make-believe tea, and they sat around the board, guzzling in their greed, and really, what with their chatter and recriminations, the noise, as Wendy said, was positively deafening. To be sure, she did not mind noise, but she simply would not have them grabbing things and then excusing themselves by saying that Toodles had pushed their elbow. There was a fixed rule that they must never hit back at meals, but should refer the matter of dispute to Wendy by raising the right arm politely and saying, "I complain of so-and-so." But what usually happened was that they forgot to do this, or did it too much. "Silence!" cried Wendy, when, for the 20th time, she had told them that they were not all to speak at once. "Is your mug empty, Slightly, darling?" "Not quite empty, Mummy," Slightly said, after looking into an imaginary mug. "He hasn't even begun to drink his milk," Nibs interposed. This was telling, and Slightly seized his chance. "I complain of Nibs," he cried promptly. John, however, had held up his hand first. "Well, John, may I sit in Peter's chair as he is not here?" "Sit in Father's chair, John?" Wendy was scandalized. "Certainly not." "He's not really our father," John answered. "He didn't even know how a father does till I showed him." This was grumbling, we complain of John?" cried the twins. Toodles held up his hand. He was so much the humblest of them. Indeed, he was the only humble one, that Wendy was specially gentle with him. "I don't suppose," Toodles said diffidently, "that I could be father." "No, Toodles." Once Toodles began, which was not very often, he had a silly way of going on. "As I can't be father," he said heavily, "I don't suppose, Michael, you would let me be baby?" "No, I won't," Michael rapped out. He was already in his basket. "As I can't be baby," Toodles said, getting heavier and heavier and heavier. "Do you think I could be a twin?" "No, indeed," replied the twins. "It's awfully difficult to be a twin." "As I can't be anything important," said Toodles, "would any of you like to see me do a trick?" "No," they all replied. Then at last he stopped. "I hadn't really any hope," he said. The hateful telling broke out again. "Slightly is coughing on the table. The twins began with cheesecakes. Curly is taking both butter and honey. Nibs is speaking with his mouth full. I complain of the twins. I complain of Curly. I complain of Nibs." Oh dear," cried Wendy. "I'm sure I sometimes think that spinsters are to be envied." She told them to clear away and sat down to her work basket, a heavy load of stockings, and every knee with a hole in it as usual. "Wendy," scolded Michael, "I'm too big for a cradle." "I must have somebody in the cradle," she said, almost tartly. "And you're the littlest. A cradle is such a nice, homely thing to have about a house." While she sewed, they played around her. Such a group of happy faces and dancing limbs lit up by that romantic fire. It had become a very familiar scene, this, in the home under the ground. But we are looking on it for the last time. There was a step above, and Wendy, you may be sure, was the first to recognize it. "Children, I hear your father's step. He likes you to meet him at the door." Above, the tribesmen crouched before Peter. "Watch well, braves, I have spoken." And then, as so often before, the happy children dragged him from his tree. As so often before, but never again. He had brought nuts for the boys, as well as the correct time for Wendy. Peter, you just spoil them, you know, Wendy simpered. Ah, old lady, said Peter, hanging up his gun. It was me told him mothers are called old lady, Michael whispered to Curly. I complain of Michael, said Curly instantly. The first twin came to Peter. Father, we want to dance. Dance away, my little man, said Peter, who was in high good humor. But we want you to dance. Peter was really the best dancer among them, but he pretended to be scandalized. Me, my old bones would rattle. And Mummy, too. What? Cried Wendy. The mother of such an armful dance. But on a Saturday night, slightly insinuated. It was not really Saturday night. At least, it may have been, for they had long lost count of the days. But always, if they wanted to do anything special, they said this was Saturday night, and then they did it. Of course it is Saturday night, Wendy said, relenting. People of our figure, Wendy. But it is only among our own children. True, true. So they were told they could dance, but they must put on their pajamas first. Ah, old lady, Peter said aside to Wendy, warming himself by the fire and looking at her as she sat turning a heel. There's nothing more pleasant for an evening for you and me when the day's toil is over than to rest by the fire with the little ones nearby. It is sweet, Peter, isn't it? Wendy said, frightfully gratified. Peter, I think Curly has your nose. Michael takes after you. She went to him and put her hand on his shoulder. Dear Peter, she said, with such a large family, of course, I have now passed my best. But you don't want to exchange me, do you? No, Wendy. Certainly, he did not want to change. But he looked at her uncomfortably, blinking, you know, like one not sure whether he was awake or asleep. Peter, what is it? I was just thinking, he said, a little scared. It's only make-believe, isn't it, that I'm their father? Oh, yes, Wendy said primly. You see, he continued apologetically, it would make me seem so old to be their real father. But they are ours, Peter. Yours and mine. But not really, Wendy. he asked anxiously. Not if you don't wish it, she replied, and she distinctly heard his sigh of relief. Here, Tink, who was in her bedroom, eavesdropping, squeaked out something rude. She says she glories in being abandoned, Peter interpreted. He had a sudden idea. Perhaps Tink wants to be my mother. You silly ass, cried Tinker Bell in a passion. She had said it so often that Wendy needed no translation.